Tonight, we travel back more than 2,000 years to ancient China, to a time of warring kingdoms and bloodshed, where one remarkable man dared to ask a question so dangerous that powerful rulers would eventually try to erase him from history entirely. Picture this scene: a grand palace in the state of Chu, one of the mightiest kingdoms of ancient China. The year is approximately 440 BCE. Inside the throne room, an elderly engineer named Gongshu Ban, perhaps the most famous inventor of his age, stands proudly beside his latest creation: enormous siege ladders, tall enough to scale any city wall, ingenious enough to carry battalions of soldiers over fortifications that had stood for generations. The king of Chu smiles. With these weapons he will crush the tiny neighboring state of Song. Tens of thousands will die, cities will burn, and there is nothing anyone can do to stop him. Then a stranger enters the throne room. He is exhausted, covered in dust from the road, his feet wrapped in bloody rags. He has walked for 10 days and 10 nights without rest, covering more than 300 miles across hostile territory. His clothes mark him as a common labourer, perhaps a carpenter or craftsman. He carries no weapons, he brings no army. He has only his mind, his voice, and a love for humanity so fierce that it drove him to attempt the impossible. This man's name was Mozi, and in the next few hours, using nothing but logic, moral argument, and a demonstration with his belt and some wooden sticks, he will single-handedly prevent a war and save an entire nation. Yet, here is the mystery that will thread through tonight's journey. Despite accomplishing feats that should have immortalized him forever, despite founding one of the most influential schools of thought in ancient China, despite developing ideas about universal love and human equality that would not appear in Western philosophy for another 2,000 years, Mozi was deliberately forgotten. His books were burned, his followers were scattered, his name was erased from the stories that educated generations of Chinese scholars. Why? What was so dangerous about a carpenter who taught people to love one another? Tonight, as you settle into rest, we will uncover the answer to that question. We will walk alongside Mozi through the blood-soaked landscape of the Warring States period. We will watch him challenge kings and scholars with arguments so powerful that they could not be refuted, only suppressed. And we will discover why his message of universal love, spoken 25 centuries ago, resonates with striking urgency in our own troubled times. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. There is something deeply moving about imagining these ancient words of compassion drifting across continents, settling into minds, preparing for sleep. If you find peace in these explorations of wisdom, please consider subscribing to join our quiet community of nighttime philosophers. Your presence here helps these gentle conversations reach others who seek understanding in the stillness of evening. I do hope Mozi's revolutionary vision will guide you toward rest, though I must warn you, his ideas have a way of quietly transforming how you see the world. Should you find yourself still awake at the end, at least you will drift off knowing about one of history's most remarkable forgotten heroes. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow the measured rhythm of ancient Chinese wisdom to carry you gently forward. After all, what could be more soothing than discovering how one humble craftsman sought to end all war and teach humanity to love itself? To understand Mozi, we must first understand the world that created him, and that world was drowning in blood. The period of Chinese history known as the Warring States lasted from approximately 475 to 221 BCE. Imagine nearly 3 centuries of continuous warfare, of kingdoms rising and falling like waves against a shore, of armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands clashing across vast plains, while cities burned and populations were slaughtered or enslaved. This was not war as a punctuation mark between periods of peace. This was war as the permanent condition of existence. 7 major kingdoms dominated the landscape: Qin in the west, Chu in the south, Qi in the east, and Yan in the north, with Han, Wei, and Zhao competing for the central territories. Each kingdom believed itself destined to eventually conquer all the others and reunify China under its rule. Each kingdom built massive armies, developed new weapons, and employed strategists whose sole purpose was planning the destruction of their neighbors. The scale of violence was almost incomprehensible. Ancient Chinese sources record battles involving 400,000 soldiers on a single side. They describe sieges lasting years, entire populations starving behind walls while armies waited patiently outside. They tell of commanders who executed prisoners by the tens of thousands, sometimes burying them alive in mass graves that archaeologists have uncovered in our own time. The Battle of Changping in 260 BCE, though it occurred after Mozi's death, illustrates the horrifying scale of warring states' warfare. According to traditional accounts, the victorious Qin army executed 400,000 surrendered Zhao soldiers in a single massacre. Whether that exact number is accurate or somewhat exaggerated by later chroniclers, the event captures something true about the period. Human life had become cheap. Kingdoms thought nothing of annihilating entire populations in pursuit of territorial advantage, and the professional armies that had replaced citizen militias fought with a cold efficiency that maximized destruction. Weapons technology advanced rapidly during this period, driven by the constant pressure of military competition. Iron replaced bronze, allowing for sharper and more durable swords. Crossbows appeared, enabling common soldiers to kill at distances that had once required years of archery training to achieve. Cavalry tactics improved. Siege warfare became more sophisticated. Each innovation gave temporary advantage to its developers before spreading to rival states, triggering another round of innovation in an endless arms race. For ordinary people, life during the Warring States period was characterized by constant fear and uncertainty. A farmer might plant his crops in spring only to watch an invading army trample them in summer. A merchant might build a thriving business in one kingdom only to see that kingdom conquered and absorbed by another, his contracts worthless, his connections severed. Parents raised children knowing that those children might be conscripted into armies and never return, or that enemy soldiers might appear at their door at any moment. Yet amid this chaos, something remarkable was also happening. The very instability of the period created space for new ideas to flourish. With no single authority able to control thought and expression, philosophers from diverse backgrounds began proposing radically different visions for how society should be organized. This era became known as the 100 Schools of Thought, and it produced some of the most influential philosophy in human history. Confucius had already lived and died by the time of the Warring States, but his followers were spreading his teachings throughout the kingdoms, emphasizing social harmony through proper relationships, ritual propriety, and respect for tradition. Meanwhile, early Taoists were developing ideas about naturalness and non-interference that would eventually crystallize in texts like the Tao Te Ching. Legalists were arguing that only strict laws and harsh punishments could create order from chaos. Military strategists were writing treatises on warfare that remain studied in military academies today. Into this intellectual ferment came the Mohists, followers of the philosopher Mozi, and their ideas were perhaps the most radical of all. While Confucians emphasized family loyalty and social hierarchy, while legalists focused on power and control, Mozi and his followers asked a question so simple it was revolutionary. What if we loved everyone equally? The suffering of the Warring States period was not abstract for Mozi. He witnessed it directly. He saw refugees fleeing destroyed cities. He watched families torn apart by conscription. He observed how the powerful justified slaughter through elaborate rhetoric, while ordinary people paid the price in blood. And he concluded that the root cause of all this misery was something that seemed, on its surface, almost innocent: partiality. People loved their own families more than their neighbors. Rulers loved their own kingdoms more than other kingdoms. Soldiers loved their own comrades more than the enemy soldiers they were ordered to kill. This partiality, this preference for some over others, was the seed from which all violence grew. If a person cares more about their own possessions than their neighbor's possessions, theft becomes possible. If a ruler cares more about their own territory than their neighbor's territory, conquest becomes inevitable. If a general cares more about his own soldiers than enemy soldiers, massacre becomes acceptable. The logic seemed inescapable, and from it Mozi drew a conclusion that would make him enemies among the powerful for the rest of his life and beyond. The solution to human suffering was universal love, impartial care for all people regardless of their relationship to us. As you listen to this description of ancient warfare and suffering, perhaps you can feel something of what drove Mozi to his revolutionary conclusions. The world he inhabited was not so different from our own. We too live amid conflict and division. We too struggle with questions about who deserves our care and concern. We too wonder if there might be a better way for human beings to live together. Let yourself drift back through the centuries as we continue our journey. The sounds of ancient battlefields fade into the distance. The dust of marching armies settles, and we turn our attention to the remarkable man who emerged from this chaos with a message of love that proved too powerful to be ignored and too dangerous to be allowed to survive. The man who would become Mozi was born around 470 BCE, roughly a decade after the death of Confucius. His birthplace was the state of Lu, the same small kingdom in eastern China that had produced Confucius himself. This coincidence of geography would prove significant, for Mozi's philosophy developed partly in direct response to and rejection of Confucian teachings. But where Confucius came from an aristocratic background, tracing his ancestry to ancient nobility, Mozi's origins were humble. The historical evidence suggests he was born into a family of craftsmen, likely carpenters or woodworkers. This was not a small detail, but a defining feature of his character and his thought. In ancient China, where social status determined nearly everything about a person's life, being born a manual laborer meant growing up outside the educated elite, experiencing firsthand the struggles and concerns of ordinary working people. Even his name carries possible hints of his lowly origins. Mo is the Chinese character meaning ink or black, and some scholars have speculated that it might refer to the practice of tattooing criminals with dark ink as a form of punishment and permanent marking. If this theory is correct, then Mozi or one of his recent ancestors might have borne the stigma of criminality, might have known intimately what it meant to be an outcast in Chinese society. Other scholars suggest the name simply indicates dark skin from working outdoors, common among labourers, but rare among pale-complexioned aristocrats who spent their days indoors studying classical texts. Whatever the exact circumstances of his birth, Mozi grew up with practical skills that would serve him throughout his life. He learned to work with wood and metal. He developed an understanding of engineering and construction that would eventually make him ancient China's leading expert in defensive fortification. Unlike philosophers who dealt purely in abstractions, Mozi could build things, could translate ideas into physical reality, could solve practical problems through craft and ingenuity. The young Mozi also received an education in Confucian teachings, which by his time had become the dominant philosophical tradition among educated Chinese. He studied the classical texts. He learned the elaborate rituals that Confucians believed essential to social harmony. He absorbed the teachings about filial piety, respect for elders, and the importance of proper relationships between rulers and subjects, parents and children, husbands and wives. And then, after thoroughly mastering these teachings, he rejected them. The reasons for Mozi's break with Confucianism reveal much about his character and the direction his thought would take. He came to see Confucian philosophy as fundamentally inadequate to address the real problems facing ordinary people. The elaborate rituals and ceremonies that Confucians valued so highly seemed to Mozi like wasteful extravagances that consumed resources better spent on feeding the hungry and housing the poor. The Confucian emphasis on gradations in love, caring more for family than strangers, more for one's own kingdom than other kingdoms, seemed to Mozi like a recipe for the very conflicts tearing China apart. Most troubling to Mozi was what he perceived as fatalism in Confucian thought. Some Confucians taught that human destiny was largely determined by heaven, by forces beyond individual control. If a person was poor, perhaps it was their fate to be poor. If a kingdom was conquered, perhaps it was meant to be conquered. This attitude of acceptance struck Mozi as both philosophically wrong and morally dangerous. It encouraged passivity in the face of injustice, resignation in the face of suffering. It told people not to struggle against their circumstances, but to accept them with grace. Mozi would have none of this. He believed fiercely in human agency, in the power of effort and will to change circumstances. He looked at the suffering around him and refused to accept that it was inevitable or fated. The poor were poor because of specific policies and practices that could be changed. Wars happened because of specific decisions made by specific rulers who could choose differently. There was nothing written in the stars that required human beings to treat each other with cruelty and indifference. This confidence in human capability to improve their own conditions would become a cornerstone of Mohist philosophy. Against the Confucian tendency toward acceptance and harmony with existing conditions, Mozi proposed active intervention, deliberate effort to make the world better. Against the belief that heaven determined outcomes, Mozi argued that heaven merely provided standards, and that humans were responsible for living up to those standards through their own choices and actions. As Mozi developed his ideas and began teaching, he attracted followers from backgrounds similar to his own: craftsmen, engineers, technicians, and practical workers who understood the value of getting things done rather than merely discussing them. These followers would eventually form one of the most remarkable organizations in ancient Chinese history, a disciplined community that combined philosophical study with practical action, that hired itself out to various states while maintaining its own internal governance, that was prepared to fight and die for its principles. But all that lay in the future. For now, imagine the young Mozi, recently departed from his Confucian teachers, beginning to articulate his own vision of how human beings should live. Imagine him looking out at a world of warfare and suffering and refusing to accept that this was simply how things had to be. Imagine him formulating, for the first time in human history, a systematic philosophy built on the radical premise that we should care equally for all people, that the stranger on the other side of the world matters just as much as our own family members. The night is still young, and there is much more of Mozi's story to tell. Let your mind settle into the rhythm of his journey as we explore the revolutionary doctrine that would make him both beloved by ordinary people and feared by those in power. At the heart of Mozi's teaching lay a concept so simple it could be stated in 2 words, yet so radical it threatened the entire social order of ancient China. That concept was Jian Ai, usually translated as universal love or impartial care. And to understand why it was so revolutionary, we must first understand what it was arguing against. In Confucian ethics, which dominated educated Chinese thought during Mozi's lifetime, love was understood to be naturally graded. A person should love their parents more than their neighbors more than strangers, their own kingdom more than foreign kingdoms. This was not considered selfish, but rather natural and proper, reflecting the fundamental structure of human relationships. The family was the core unit of society, and from it radiated outward circles of decreasing obligation and affection. Confucians pointed to common experience to support this view. Was it not obvious that people naturally loved their own children more than other people's children? Was it not clear that a person would sacrifice more for their own mother than for a stranger? These natural feelings of greater love for those closest to us were not flaws to be overcome, but foundations upon which all virtue was built. A person who did not love their own parents could not be trusted to love anyone properly. Mozi looked at this seemingly reasonable position and saw in it the root of all human suffering. If I love my own family more than yours, he argued, then I will prioritize my family's welfare over yours. If this prioritization extends to taking from you to give to mine, then theft is born. If rulers love their own kingdoms more than other kingdoms, they will prioritize their own territory's expansion. If this prioritization extends to conquest and warfare, then mass slaughter follows inevitably. The logic was relentless. Partiality breeds preference. Preference breeds competition. Competition breeds conflict. And conflict breeds destruction. Consider, Mozi asked his listeners, the most basic moral intuitions we all share. We all agree that stealing is wrong. We all agree that murder is wrong. We all agree that lying and cheating and betraying trust are wrong. But what is the common element in all these wrongs? What makes them evil? The answer, Mozi concluded, is partiality. The thief cares more about himself than his victim. The murderer cares more about his own interest than his victim's life. The liar cares more about his own advantage than the truth that serves everyone equally. Therefore, if we wish to eliminate these evils, we must eliminate their root cause. We must replace partiality with impartiality. We must learn to care for all people equally, without discrimination based on family, kingdom, or any other distinction. We must love our neighbour's parent as we love our own parent, our neighbour's children as we love our own children, our neighbour's kingdom as we love our own kingdom. This was not merely an ideal to admire from a distance. Mozi believed it was practically achievable and that it would produce tangible benefits for everyone. If I know that you care for my family as much as your own, I can trust you absolutely. I can leave my children in your care without worry. I can share my resources with you knowing you will not take more than your share, and you can trust me in the same way. Imagine a society built on such mutual trust. Imagine the cooperation that would become possible. Imagine the conflicts that would simply evaporate. The Confucians raised objections, of course. How could anyone truly love a stranger as much as their own mother? Was Mozi asking people to suppress their natural feelings? Was he demanding the impossible, and therefore setting up an ethical standard that no one could actually meet? Mozi had responses to each of these objections, and his responses reveal the practical, consequentialist bent of his thinking. First, he did not ask people to feel identical emotions toward all people. He asked them to act with equal consideration for all people's welfare. The inner feelings might differ, but the outward behavior, the actual treatment of others, should be impartial. A judge should not feel the same emotional connection to a defendant as to their own child, but the judge should nonetheless treat the defendant fairly, with the same consideration for their rights and interests as they would want for their own family member. Second, Mozi argued that natural feelings were not fixed and unchangeable. People could be educated, could develop new habits of thought and feeling through practice and instruction. The parent who initially loves only their own children can learn to extend that concern to all children. The citizen who initially cares only about their own kingdom can learn to care about humanity as a whole. This is not suppressing natural feelings, but expanding them, not diminishing love, but multiplying it. Third, and perhaps most powerfully, Mozi pointed to the actual consequences of partiality versus impartiality. Look around, he told his listeners. Look at the world that partiality has created. The wars, the famines, the injustices, the poverty amid plenty. Now imagine what the world would look like if everyone practiced universal love. The contrast was stark enough to answer any theoretical objections. Mozi also offered what might be called a divine sanction for universal love. Heaven itself, he argued, practices impartial care. The sun shines on everyone equally. The rain falls on all fields without discrimination. The harvest feeds the good and the wicked alike. If heaven shows no partiality, who are we to practice it? To love partially is to set ourselves against the very nature of the cosmos. This appeal to heaven was strategic as well as sincere. In an age when rulers claimed divine mandate for their actions, Mozi was arguing that heaven actually opposed their aggressive wars and their indifference to common people's suffering. The true will of heaven was universal love, and rulers who practiced partiality were not serving heaven but defying it. As you contemplate these ancient arguments, perhaps you can sense their continuing relevance. The tension between caring for our own and caring for all remains unresolved in human affairs. We still struggle to extend our concern beyond our immediate circles. We still watch conflicts fueled by partiality, by the conviction that our group matters more than theirs. Mozi's challenge echoes across the centuries. What if we tried something different? What if we loved everyone? The night deepens, and our exploration continues. Rest in these ideas as we turn to the full system of thought that Mozi built upon his foundation of universal love. Universal love was the core of Mozi's philosophy, but around that core he constructed an elaborate ethical system, addressing virtually every aspect of human life. This system came to be organized into 10 doctrines, typically paired into 5 complementary sets. Together they formed a comprehensive vision of how society should be organized and how individuals should live. The first pair concerned the selection of leaders. Mozi called these principles elevating the worthy and conforming upward. In an age when political power was inherited through aristocratic bloodlines, Mozi argued that positions of authority should go to whoever was most capable of exercising them well, regardless of their family background. A carpenter's son who possessed wisdom and virtue should be elevated over a duke's son who lacked these qualities. Merit, not birth, should determine who led. This was not merely an abstract principle, but a practical reform with radical implications. If the most capable people filled government positions, Mozi reasoned, then governance would improve dramatically. Problems would be solved more efficiently. Resources would be distributed more fairly. Wars would be avoided through better diplomacy. The entire system would work better simply by putting the right people in charge. Conforming upward complemented this by describing how those who were elevated should relate to those above them in the hierarchy. Having identified and elevated the worthy, everyone should then conform their behavior to the standards set by their superiors, ultimately conforming to the will of heaven itself. This created a chain of accountability reaching from the lowest village official to the emperor to heaven itself, ensuring that all actions could be judged against an objective standard. The second pair of doctrines addressed how people should treat one another. These were universal love and rejecting aggression. We have already explored universal love in depth. Rejecting aggression applied the same principle specifically to warfare. Mozi condemned offensive warfare, wars of conquest and territorial expansion, as the greatest crime a ruler could commit. While defending one's people against attack was justified, attacking others to take their land and resources was simply murder, multiplied by tens of thousands. Consider the logical clarity of Mozi's argument against aggressive war. If a person kills another person and steals their property, we call that person a murderer and a thief. We condemn them, punish them, consider them among the worst of criminals. But if a ruler kills tens of thousands of people and steals their entire kingdom, we call that ruler a conqueror, celebrate their achievement, and write laudatory histories of their reign. Where is the logic in this? The crime is identical, only the scale differs. If anything, the ruler's crime is far worse precisely because it is committed on such a massive scale. The third pair concerned resource management. Moderation in use called for simplicity and frugality in daily life, avoiding wasteful consumption that diverted resources from those who truly needed them. Mozi criticized the elaborate court entertainments, the luxurious clothing, the extravagant palaces that rulers built while their people went hungry. Every resource spent on unnecessary luxury was a resource unavailable for food, shelter, and other genuine necessities. Moderation in funerals applied this principle to death rituals specifically. Confucians placed great emphasis on elaborate funeral ceremonies and extended mourning periods, sometimes lasting 3 years. Mozi saw these practices as doubly harmful. The expense of elaborate funerals consumed resources better spent on the living. The extended mourning periods removed productive members from the workforce, reducing the community's ability to provide for itself. He advocated for simple, dignified funerals that honored the dead without impoverishing the living. The fourth pair addressed metaphysical and religious questions. Heaven's intention argued that heaven possessed consciousness and will, that it cared about human affairs, and that it desired universal love and mutual benefit among all people. Heaven served as the ultimate moral authority, the standard against which all human actions could be judged. Rulers who defied heaven's intention by practicing partiality and aggression would eventually face consequences. Elucidating ghosts extended this supernatural framework to include the spirits of the dead. Mozi argued that ghosts existed and that they observed human behavior, rewarding the virtuous and punishing the wicked. This belief served a practical function by reinforcing moral behavior even when no human observers were present. Those who might be tempted to act unjustly in secret would be deterred by the knowledge that the spirits were always watching. The fifth and final pair addressed matters that might seem surprising to modern readers. Rejecting music was not an attack on all music, but specifically on the elaborate court performances that consumed vast resources while ordinary people suffered. The orchestras, the dancers, the expensive instruments, the time taken from productive labor, all of this represented, in Mozi's view, unconscionable waste. Music that brought simple pleasure to ordinary people was fine. Music that drained state treasuries was wrong. Rejecting fatalism attacked the belief that human destiny was predetermined and unchangeable. As we discussed earlier, Mozi believed passionately in human agency. in our ability to change our circumstances through effort and will. Fatalism discouraged such effort by suggesting that outcomes were already determined. If the poor were fated to be poor, why bother trying to improve their conditions? If war was inevitable, why bother working for peace? Mozi rejected this passivity absolutely. Human beings could and should strive to make the world better. Together, these 10 doctrines formed a comprehensive ethical and political philosophy. They addressed governance, warfare, economics, religion, and personal conduct. They applied the core principle of universal love to every domain of human activity, and they did so with a practical focus that distinguished Mohism from more abstract philosophical traditions. What strikes many modern readers about these doctrines is their familiarity. The idea that leaders should be selected based on merit rather than birth is now taken for granted in most democratic societies. The condemnation of aggressive warfare forms the basis of international law. The call for moderation and opposition to wasteful luxury echoes in contemporary environmental movements. The belief in human agency and the rejection of fatalism underlies modern ideas about social progress. Mozi articulated these ideas more than 2,000 years ago in a world very different from our own. Yet they speak to enduring human concerns and aspirations. As you rest tonight, consider how ancient wisdom can illuminate present challenges. The questions Mozi asked, about how we should treat one another, about what we owe to strangers, about how society should be organized, remain as urgent today as they were in the Warring States period. The night continues its slow journey toward morning, and we continue our journey through Mozi's remarkable life. Soon we will come to the story that has made Mozi immortal in Chinese memory, the tale of 10 days and 10 nights, of a king and an engineer, of a war that was prevented by one man's determination and love. If there is a single story that captures everything essential about Mozi, about his courage, his brilliance, his compassion, and the tragic irony of his life, it is the story of how he prevented the invasion of Song. The state of Song was small and weak, squeezed between powerful neighbors who coveted its territory. It had no chance of defending itself against a determined attacker, and by approximately 440 BCE, the mighty state of Chu had decided that Song's time had come. Chu was one of the 7 great powers of the Warring States period, commanding vast armies and enormous resources. Its king had ambitions to expand northward, and Song lay directly in his path. But Song, despite its weakness, had strong walls around its cities. Conquering it would require lengthy sieges that would cost many Chu soldiers' lives and drain the treasury. Enter Gongshu Ban, known in Chinese tradition as one of the greatest engineers who ever lived. Some scholars identify him with the legendary figure Liu Ban, credited with inventing numerous tools and techniques still used today. Whoever he was historically, the story presents him as a genius of military engineering who had developed a devastating new weapon, cloud ladders. These were not ordinary siege ladders, but sophisticated assault platforms capable of carrying many soldiers over walls that had resisted attack for generations. With these devices, Chu could storm Song's fortifications quickly, minimizing casualties among its own troops while maximizing destruction among the defenders. The king of Chu was delighted. Preparations for invasion began. News of these preparations reached Mozi, who was far away in the state of Qi. When he learned that Chu intended to destroy Song using Gongshu Ban's cloud ladders, he did not wait to consult with others or make elaborate plans. He simply began walking. Think about what this meant. Mozi was not a young man. The journey from Qi to the Chu capital was over 300 miles across difficult terrain, through territories that might be hostile. There was no guarantee that the king of Chu would even agree to see him, and even if granted an audience, what could one man, a commoner, a former craftsman, hope to accomplish against a king's settled determination to wage war? Mozi walked. He walked through day and night. He walked until his feet bled and he had to tear strips from his clothing to wrap them. He walked through exhaustion and hunger, and whatever fears must have haunted him on that long journey. The distance from Qi to the Chu capital, roughly 300 miles of ancient roads and unmarked paths, would have been difficult for a young man in peak condition. Mozi was no longer young, yet he covered the distance in 10 days and 10 nights. sleeping only in brief intervals, pushing himself beyond what seemed physically possible. What drove him forward? Not glory. No one would remember his name for this journey. Not reward. The people of Song would never know what he had done for them, not even survival. By walking into the court of a hostile king to argue against a planned invasion, he was risking execution. What drove him was something simpler and harder to understand: the knowledge that thousands of people would die if he did nothing, and the conviction that he could not live with himself if he failed to try. At the end of those 10 days, exhausted beyond imagining, his clothing in rags and his feet wrapped in bloody cloth, he arrived at the palace of the King of Chu. The audacity of his appearance must have astonished everyone present. Here was a ragged stranger, clearly of low birth, demanding an audience with one of the most powerful rulers in China to discuss matters of war and peace. By all logic, he should have been turned away at the gate, or worse. But something in Mozi's manner, or perhaps curiosity about what could drive a man to such extremity, induced the court to grant him entry. The confrontation that followed was a masterpiece of rhetorical and strategic genius. Mozi did not begin by condemning the planned invasion. Instead, he approached Gong Shuban, the engineer whose inventions made the invasion possible. "I have heard," Mozi said, "that you have built cloud ladders with which to attack Song. But what crime has Song committed against Chu? Chu has more land than it can use, yet its people are few. To kill those who are already few in order to gain land that is already excessive, this cannot be called wise. Song has committed no offence against Chu. To attack a state that has done no wrong cannot be called righteous. To understand these things yet not fight against them cannot be called loyal. To fight but not succeed cannot be called strong. To refuse to kill few but agree to kill many cannot be called understanding distinctions." Gong Shuban was moved by these arguments, but deflected responsibility. He had already promised his services to the king. It was not his decision to make. So Mozi went to the king himself and made essentially the same argument, framed even more pointedly. Suppose a man has a fine carriage but envies his neighbour's rickety cart and wants to steal it. Suppose he has embroidered robes but envies his neighbour's rough clothing and wants to steal them. Suppose he has meat and grain but envies his neighbour's chaff and husks and wants to steal them. What kind of man would this be? The king answered immediately. He would be a kleptomaniac. Your kingdom has land spanning 5,000 leagues, while Song has only 500. This is like the fine carriage compared to the rickety cart. Your kingdom has Yunmeng, filled with rhinoceros and deer, and your rivers abound with fish, turtles, and crocodiles. Song has not even pheasants, rabbits, or fish. This is like the meat and grain compared to the chaff. Your kingdom has tall pines, catalpa trees, and camphor, while Song has no tall trees at all. This is like the embroidered robes compared to rough clothing. Given these circumstances, why would your majesty want to attack Song? The king was embarrassed, but still unwilling to abandon his plans. After all, Gong Shuban had built these magnificent cloud ladders. It would be a shame not to use them. Here Mozi made his decisive move. He removed his belt and laid it on the floor, using it to represent Song's city walls. He took small pieces of wood to represent military equipment. Then he invited Gong Shuban to simulate the attack, using whatever tactics the engineer could devise. What followed was essentially a war game, a strategic simulation that anticipated methods not widely used in the West until the 20th century. 9 times Gong Shuban launched attacks with his wooden pieces. 9 times Mozi repelled them. The great engineer exhausted his arsenal of tactics, yet the philosopher carpenter defeated everyone. Finally, Gong Shuban said, "I know how I could defeat you, but I will not say." Mozi replied, "I know your plan, but I too will not say." The king, puzzled, asked Mozi what they meant. "Gong Shuban plans to have me killed," Mozi explained calmly. "He thinks that without me, Song will have no defender. But my disciple Chinguli and 300 followers are already on Song's walls with my defensive equipment, waiting for Chu's forces. Even if you kill me, you cannot destroy them." The king of Chu sat in silence, contemplating this information. Then he spoke the words that Mozi had walked 300 miles to hear. "We will not attack Song." A single man, armed with nothing but moral arguments and strategic brilliance, had prevented a war and saved tens of thousands of lives. But the story does not end there, and its ending reveals something profound about the nature of virtue and the recognition it rarely receives. Mozi began the long walk home to Song, the kingdom he had just saved. When he arrived at the border, it was raining heavily. Seeking shelter, he approached one of the city gates. The guards did not recognize him. They saw only a ragged stranger, soaking wet, of no apparent importance. They refused him entry, and so Mozi, who had just walked 600 miles round trip to save this very city and all its people, was forced to spend the night outside in the rain, sleeping in a ditch while those he had saved slumbered comfortably behind the walls he had preserved for them. This image has haunted Chinese readers for millennia. There is something unbearably poignant about it, this portrait of the selfless hero denied even the most basic hospitality by those who owe him everything yet know nothing of what he has done. It captures something true about how the world often treats its benefactors, how virtue frequently goes unrecognized and unrewarded, how those who sacrifice most are often those who receive least in return. But if this bothered Mozi, there is no record of complaint. He had not walked to Song and back for recognition or reward. He had walked because people would have died otherwise, and because he could not stand by while that happened. His satisfaction came from the accomplishment itself, not from any praise or gratitude it might generate. As you rest tonight, perhaps that image will settle into your mind. The old philosopher sleeping in the rain after saving a nation, unknown to those he saved, asking nothing in return. It is an image that speaks to something deep in human aspiration, to our longing for goodness that transcends self-interest, for love that expects nothing back. Mozi embodied that aspiration more completely than almost any figure in history. The rain continues to fall in that ancient night, and Mozi sleeps, and the people of Song sleep behind their walls, dreaming perhaps of whatever ordinary people dream, never knowing how close they came to destruction or who stood between them and the abyss. The story of Gongshuban reveals that Mozi was not merely a philosopher who discussed ideas, but a leader who organized action. The 300 disciples waiting on Song's walls with defensive equipment suggest something remarkable about the movement Mozi founded. It was not just a school of thought, but something closer to an organization, a disciplined community prepared to put its principles into practice at considerable risk. The Mohist organization represented something unique in the ancient world. It combined philosophical study with practical training, ethical commitment with military capability, intellectual inquiry with community discipline. Its members lived together, shared resources, practiced the frugality they preached, and hired themselves out to various states as advisors, engineers, diplomats, and defenders. At the head of this organization stood a figure called the Juzi, usually translated as Grand Master. The Grand Master held absolute authority over the community, appointing his own successor and commanding the loyalty of all members. When the Grand Master issued an order, it was obeyed without question. When the Grand Master interpreted Mohist doctrine, that interpretation became binding. This might seem to contradict the democratic implications of Mohist thought, which emphasized selecting leaders based on merit and caring equally for all people. But Mozi apparently believed that effective action required clear command structures, that a community dedicated to changing the world could not afford the luxury of endless debate and divided councils. The Grand Master earned his position through demonstrated wisdom and virtue, and members followed him because they trusted his judgment, not because they were forced to. The members themselves came predominantly from backgrounds similar to Mozi's own. They were craftsmen, engineers, technicians, practical workers who valued concrete results over abstract theorizing. They included experts in defensive warfare, in the construction of fortifications, in the design and operation of military equipment. They were, in a sense, ancient China's first defense contractors, offering their services to any state that needed protection against aggression. But their commitment went far beyond professional expertise. Mohist followers lived according to strict standards of personal conduct. They practiced the moderation and frugality that their doctrines prescribed. They wore simple clothing. They ate simple food. They rejected the luxuries and pleasures that might have been available to people of their skills and abilities. Their lifestyle was a living argument for the principles they advocated. The depth of Mohist commitment is illustrated by a story that takes place several decades after Mozi's death. A Mohist named Meng Sheng served as guardian of a fortress in the state of Chu, responsible to a local lord who had given him a talisman as proof of his authority. When political circumstances changed and Meng Sheng's lord lost power, a new faction demanded that Meng Sheng surrender the fortress. Meng Sheng refused. He had accepted responsibility for the fortress, and he would not abandon that responsibility simply because the political winds had shifted. His lord had not released him from his obligation. Therefore, he would defend the fortress until his lord either released him or the fortress fell. The outcome was inevitable. Meng Sheng and 183 of his followers died defending a position they knew they could not hold, for a cause that no longer had any practical significance, because they had given their word and Mohists kept their word regardless of consequences. Before the final assault, Meng Sheng sent 2 young disciples away to preserve the community's leadership. One of them became the next Grand Master. The tradition continued even as the fortress burned. This story has troubled some readers who see in it a fanaticism that seems to contradict the Mohist emphasis on practical benefit. What benefit came from the deaths of 184 people in a lost cause? But the Mohists themselves would have answered that the benefit was integrity itself, the preservation of a community's commitment to its principles. If Mohists abandoned their posts when circumstances became difficult, what would their promises be worth? Who would trust them to defend anything? The Mohist community also engaged in activities that went beyond defensive warfare. They served as negotiators and diplomats, using their reputation for impartiality to mediate between conflicting states. They advised rulers on governance and policy, always pushing for the Mohist principles of meritocracy, universal love, and rejection of aggression. They established schools that trained new generations in both philosophical study and practical skills. At its peak, the Mohist movement rivaled Confucianism as the most influential school of thought in China. The Confucian philosopher Mencius, writing a generation after Mozi, complained that the doctrines of Mozi fill the world. This was not a compliment, but a lament. Mencius saw Mohism as a dangerous threat to proper social order, and he devoted considerable effort to arguing against it. The organizational structure of the Mohists also left a curious legacy. Later, Mohist communities apparently split into different branches, each with its own Grand Master, each developing the tradition in somewhat different directions. Some focused on defensive warfare, others on logical analysis and scientific investigation, still others on ethical and political philosophy. This diversification enriched Mohist thought, but also fragmented it, perhaps contributing to its eventual decline. As you contemplate this ancient community, perhaps you can imagine what it might have been like to be part of it, to live among people who shared your deepest commitments, to work alongside others who had dedicated their lives to the same principles you cherished, to know that when you needed them, they would stand with you, even unto death. There is something beautiful about such solidarity, even if it comes at a cost that most of us would be unwilling to pay. The Mohist community is long gone now, dispersed by persecution and absorbed into other traditions. But something of their spirit survives in every group that has organized itself around shared principles and mutual commitment, every community that has tried to change the world through coordinated action rather than isolated individual effort. The rivalry between Mozi and Confucius, or more precisely between their respective followers, shaped Chinese intellectual history for centuries. Although Confucius died before Mozi was born, making direct debate between them impossible, their disciples carried on a fierce controversy that illuminates fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the proper basis of ethics. The core disagreement concerned the nature and proper extent of love. Confucians believed in what they called graded love, caring more intensely for those closest to us and diminishing in intensity as relationships became more distant. We should love our parents most, then our siblings, then our extended family, then our neighbors, and so on outward in concentric circles of decreasing obligation. This seemed to Confucians both natural and proper, reflecting the actual structure of human emotions and relationships. Mozi rejected this view absolutely. He argued that graded love was precisely the problem, the source of all conflict and suffering. If I love my family more than your family, I will naturally favour my family's interests when they conflict with yours. This favouritism, multiplied across society, generates the theft, warfare and injustice that plague human existence. Only impartial love, caring equally for all people regardless of their relationship to us, could solve these problems. The Confucian response, articulated most powerfully by Mencius, was devastating in its rhetorical force, if not entirely fair in its logic. Mencius accused Mozi of having no father. This was not a claim about Mozi's biology, but an attack on the moral implications of his philosophy. If we should love all people equally, then we should love strangers as much as our own parents. But surely our parents deserve special love and devotion. Surely the care and sacrifice they invested in raising us creates obligations that strangers cannot claim. By teaching universal love, Mozi was effectively teaching people to abandon their duties to their parents, to treat the most sacred human relationships as no more significant than chance encounters with strangers. This argument resonated deeply in a culture that placed filial piety at the centre of moral life. Mencius went further, comparing Mozi's followers to beasts, beings without proper human feelings, unable to recognise the special significance of family bonds. The rhetoric was extreme, but it captured a genuine concern that continues to animate debates about ethics today. Mozi and his followers had responses to these charges, though they have come down to us in less developed form than the Confucian criticisms. They argued that universal love did not mean loving everyone with identical emotional intensity. It meant treating everyone's interests with equal consideration, acting toward all people with the same fairness and concern for their welfare. A person could still feel stronger emotions toward their parents, while nonetheless treating strangers with full moral seriousness. Moreover, the Mohists argued, universal love actually better served parents and families than graded love. Under a system of graded love, your parents depend on you alone for care and protection. If something happens to you, they are helpless. But under universal love, everyone cares for everyone's parents. Your parents benefit not just from your devotion, but from the concern of an entire community. They are safer, more secure, better provided for. Universal love does not diminish family welfare, but enhances it. The debate also touched on deeper questions about human nature. Confucians generally believe that moral development built upon natural feelings and tendencies. The love children naturally feel for their parents was the seed from which all virtue grew. Education and cultivation refined and extended these natural feelings, but could not create them from nothing. To ask people to love strangers as much as family was to ask them to violate their own nature. Mohists took a different view. They believed that human nature was more malleable, more subject to education and environmental influence. People could be taught to extend their natural affections, to care about distant strangers as they now cared only about close family. This was not impossible, just difficult, and requiring proper instruction and social organization. The natural feelings Confucians valorized were partly products of culture and upbringing, not fixed biological facts. Change the culture, change the upbringing, and you change what feels natural. There was also a fundamental disagreement about the role of tradition and ritual. Confucians placed great emphasis on traditional practices, believing that the elaborate ceremonies and rituals handed down from antiquity embodied deep wisdom about human relationships and social harmony. These rituals should be preserved and practiced carefully, not questioned or abandoned. Mozi challenged this reverence for tradition. He asked why we should assume that ancient practices were necessarily good. The ancients lived in different circumstances and faced different challenges. What worked for them might not work for us. Each practice should be evaluated on its merits, on its consequences for human welfare, not accepted simply because it was old. If traditional rituals consumed resources that could feed the hungry, if elaborate funerals impoverished families and removed workers from productive activity, then those traditions should be reformed or abandoned regardless of their antiquity. This dispute between tradition and reason, between respect for inherited practice and evaluation based on consequences, echoes through intellectual history down to our own time. we still argue about whether traditional values deserve special respect simply because they are traditional, or whether every practice must justify itself by its results. As night deepens and thoughts grow quieter, perhaps these ancient debates seem less urgent, more like intellectual games than matters of pressing concern. But the questions they raise touch the foundations of how we live. How much do we owe to strangers? How much to our families? Should we trust inherited wisdom or reason for ourselves? These are not abstract puzzles, but decisions we make every day, often without recognizing them as decisions at all. Mozi and the Confucians never resolved their disagreement. Chinese history eventually sided with the Confucians, but not because their arguments were stronger. Other forces intervened, as we shall see. For now, let these rival visions rest side by side in your mind, each illuminating the other, each raising questions that neither alone could ask. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Mozi's philosophy, from a modern perspective, is how thoroughly he anticipated ideas that Western thinkers would not develop for another 2,000 years. Mozi was, in effect, the world's first consequentialist, evaluating actions not by their intentions or their conformity to rules, but by their consequences for human welfare. This approach to ethics, which we now associate with philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill in the 18th and 19th centuries, was articulated by Mozi in the 5th century BCE. He explicitly stated that actions should be judged by their results, specifically by whether they promoted or harmed what he called the three benefits: increased wealth for the people, increased population, and increased social order. Consider how revolutionary this was. In an age when ethics was typically grounded in tradition, divine command, or the cultivation of virtuous character, Mozi offered a radically simple standard. Does it help people? If yes, the action is good. If no, it is bad. All the elaborate philosophical frameworks and subtle distinctions that other thinkers developed could be bypassed by asking this one straightforward question. Mozi applied this standard with relentless consistency. Elaborate funerals were bad because they harmed people by consuming resources and reducing productivity. Aggressive warfare was bad because it killed and impoverished vast numbers. Luxurious court entertainments were bad because they diverted wealth from those who needed it to those who merely wanted it. Each practice was evaluated not by its conformity to tradition or its expression of noble sentiments, but by its actual effects on human welfare. This consequentialist framework also led Mozi to develop what might be called ancient China's first systematic methodology for evaluating claims and arguments. He proposed 3 tests that any doctrine or practice should pass before being accepted. The first test was historical precedent. What did the sage kings of antiquity do? This might seem to contradict Mozi's skepticism about tradition, but he was using historical precedent differently than the Confucians. He was not arguing that ancient practices were good simply because they were ancient. Rather, he was arguing that the sage kings, renowned for their wisdom and virtue, had employed practices that proved beneficial over long periods. Their experience constituted evidence about what actually worked. The second test was empirical evidence. What do ordinary people observe and experience? This was an appeal to common sense and shared observation, to the accumulated experience of regular people living their daily lives. If a doctrine contradicted what ordinary people observed about the world, it was probably wrong. If it aligned with their experience, it was probably right. This democratic epistemology valued the knowledge of common people over the specialized theories of elite intellectuals. The third test was practical utility. Does the doctrine, when put into practice, benefit the people? This was the ultimate test, the one that trumped the others if they conflicted. A doctrine might have impressive historical pedigree and widespread popular support, but if implementing it actually harmed people, it failed the test that mattered most. These 3 tests together constituted a remarkably sophisticated methodology for evaluating claims, anticipating methods that would not become common in Western thought until the scientific revolution. Mozi was insisting on evidence, on practical demonstration, on results, rather than merely theoretical elegance or traditional authority. Later, Mohists developed these methodological insights further, producing works on logic, epistemology, mathematics, and natural science that were far ahead of their time. They analysed fallacies in reasoning, studied optics and mechanics, investigated geometry, and explored questions about knowledge and perception that Western philosophers would not address until centuries later. The Mohist canons, as these later works are called, represent some of the most sophisticated analytical philosophy produced anywhere in the ancient world. They define concepts precisely, distinguish between different kinds of statements, identify formal structures of argument, and address paradoxes that continue to puzzle philosophers today. The Mohist analysis of the relationship between names and reality, for instance, anticipates debates that would occupy Western analytic philosophy in the 20th century. But these later developments have come down to us in fragmentary and often obscure form. Much was lost when Mohist texts were destroyed or neglected. What survives suggests a tradition of rigorous analysis that might have transformed Chinese intellectual history had it been allowed to develop. As you rest tonight, consider how ideas recur across cultures and centuries. The basic insight that actions should be judged by their consequences seems almost obvious once stated, yet it required a Mozi to articulate it clearly in ancient China and a Bentham to rediscover it in modern Europe. The questions about how we know things and how we should reason about evidence seem perennial, addressed by thinkers in every age yet never finally resolved. Mozi's intellectual courage lay in following these ideas wherever they led, regardless of how uncomfortable the conclusions. If tradition was wrong, tradition should be abandoned. If common practice caused harm, common practice should be changed. If rulers committed injustice, rulers should be condemned. This fearlessness made him simultaneously admired and feared, celebrated and eventually suppressed. The night grows deeper, and abstract philosophy gives way to quieter contemplation. Let these ideas settle gently in your mind as we turn to the darker chapter of Mozi's legacy, how this revolutionary vision was deliberately erased from history, and why. For approximately 2 centuries after Mozi's death, his school flourished. Mohist communities spread across the warring states, their influence reaching deeply into political and intellectual life. They were consulted by rulers, respected by rivals, feared by those who preferred the status quo. The Confucian complaint that Mohist doctrines fill the world reflected a genuine competitive anxiety. Then something changed, and within a few generations Mohism had virtually disappeared from Chinese civilization. The process began with the unification of China under the Qin dynasty in 221 BCE. The first emperor, as he styled himself, was not merely a conqueror, but a revolutionary who sought to remake Chinese society according to his own design. His instrument was legalism, a philosophy that prioritized state power above all else, that advocated harsh laws and severe punishments, that viewed independent thought as a threat to centralized control. The first emperor standardized weights and measures, unified the writing system, and built roads connecting the far reaches of his new empire. But he also sought to standardize thought, to eliminate the competing philosophical schools that had flourished during the chaos of the warring states period. He understood, perhaps better than anyone before him, that ideas could be as dangerous as armies. A population that believed in universal love and questioned the legitimacy of aggressive warfare would be harder to mobilize for conquest. A tradition that valued merit over birth threatened the hereditary power of ruling families. Better to eliminate such ideas at the root. The first emperor's most infamous act was the burning of the books and burying of the scholars. According to traditional accounts, he ordered the destruction of all works of philosophy, history, and poetry that did not serve his regime's interests. Only technical manuals on agriculture, medicine, and divination were spared. Scholars who resisted were executed, some of them reportedly buried alive in pits outside the capital. Libraries that had accumulated centuries of accumulated wisdom were reduced to ashes in a matter of weeks. The extent of this persecution has been debated by historians, and the traditional accounts may exaggerate both its scope and its brutality. But there is no doubt that the Qin dynasty was hostile to independent philosophical traditions, and that Mohism, with its organized communities and critique of state power, would have been a natural target. The Qin dynasty lasted only 15 years before collapsing in rebellion and civil war. The Han dynasty that succeeded it took a different approach to governance, but one that proved equally fatal to Mohism. Rather than suppressing all philosophy, the Han emperors eventually adopted Confucianism as the official ideology of the state. This choice had far-reaching consequences. Confucian texts became the basis of education for anyone aspiring to government service. Confucian values became the official standards of morality and social organization. Confucian scholars monopolized the positions of influence from which they could shape intellectual life across the empire. Other philosophical traditions did not immediately disappear. Taoism survived and eventually flourished, partly because it offered a spiritual dimension that Confucianism lacked. Legalism survived in modified form within the machinery of government, its methods employed even as its explicit doctrines were officially repudiated. Buddhism would later arrive from India and transform Chinese culture in ways the early Han emperors could not have anticipated. But Mohism was different. Its doctrines were too threatening to the new social order. Universal love challenged the Confucian emphasis on hierarchical relationships and family loyalty. Meritocracy threatened the hereditary privileges of aristocratic families. The organized Mohist communities represented potential centers of resistance to state authority. The critique of aggressive warfare questioned the legitimacy of imperial expansion. There is evidence that some Mohist ideas were quietly absorbed into mainstream Chinese thought, stripped of their radical implications, and integrated into frameworks that neutralized their revolutionary potential. The merit-based examination system that would eventually select Chinese bureaucrats owed something to Mohist principles, even if it was never attributed to them. Some Buddhist ideas about universal compassion may have found receptive audiences, in part because Mozi had prepared the ground. But Mozi himself was forgotten. His book survived in fragmentary form, preserved by accident more than intention, neglected by scholars who saw no value in studying them. Of the 71 chapters attributed to his school, only 53 survive today, and many of these are damaged or incomplete. The sophisticated logical and scientific works of later Mohists were particularly neglected, falling outside the literary and historical interests that dominated traditional Chinese scholarship. For nearly 2,000 years, Mozi remained a minor figure in Chinese intellectual history, mentioned occasionally as a curious footnote, dismissed by Confucian scholars as a well-meaning eccentric whose ideas had been refuted long ago. His revolutionary vision of universal love, his pioneering consequentialist ethics, his remarkable achievements in preventing warfare and building community, all were buried under centuries of neglect. The rehabilitation of Mozi began only in the modern era, as Chinese intellectuals seeking alternatives to Confucian orthodoxy rediscovered his writings and recognized their significance. Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Republic of China, cited universal love as a foundation for modern Chinese democracy. Later communist scholars, while having their own complicated relationship with traditional philosophy, found in Mozi a voice of the common people against aristocratic privilege. Western philosophers encountering Mozi for the first time have often been struck by how modern his ideas seem. Here was a thinker who anticipated utilitarian ethics, who developed sophisticated logical methods, who built organizational structures to translate ideas into action, who challenged war and inequality and waste with arguments that remain compelling today. And here he was, hidden in plain sight, for 2 millennia, waiting to be discovered. The story of Mozi's disappearance and rediscovery raises troubling questions about how history is written and who gets to decide which ideas survive. The Confucian tradition that suppressed Mohism was not obviously superior to it on intellectual grounds. Many of the criticisms Confucians leveled against Mozi seem unconvincing on careful examination. Mohism disappeared not because it was refuted, but because those who held power found it inconvenient. As you contemplate this history, perhaps you can feel something of the tragedy it represents. How many other valuable ideas have been lost because they threatened powerful interests? How much wisdom has been buried by those who benefited from ignorance? These questions have no easy answers, but they remind us that the intellectual heritage we receive is not a neutral record of the best ideas humanity has produced. It is a curated selection, shaped by politics and power, preserving some voices while silencing others. The night continues its slow passage, and we move from this melancholy history toward questions of contemporary relevance. Mozi's ideas, long suppressed, have returned to speak to our own troubled age. More than 2 millennia after Mozi walked 300 miles to prevent a war, his ideas resonate with unexpected urgency in our contemporary world. The questions he raised about universal care and partial loyalty, about warfare and its justification, about how we should measure good actions and bad ones, remain as contested as ever. Perhaps even more contested, given the global scale on which these questions now arise. Consider the debate about human rights that has shaped international discourse since the mid-20th century. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, proclaims that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. This is remarkably close to Mozi's vision of universal love, the insistence that every person's welfare matters equally, regardless of nationality, ethnicity, or relationship to us. When human rights advocates argue that we have obligations to strangers suffering on the other side of the world, they are making essentially the same argument Mozi made against the graded love of the Confucians. Or consider the ongoing debates about nationalism and cosmopolitanism. Should we care primarily about our own nations and their interests? Or do we have obligations to humanity as a whole that might sometimes conflict with national interests? Mozi would have had clear answers to these questions. The partiality that leads us to prioritize our own nation over others is exactly the same partiality that leads to conflict and suffering. True wisdom lies in expanding our circle of concern until it encompasses all people everywhere. These debates have taken on new urgency in our interconnected world. When a disease emerges in one country, it spreads to others. When environmental destruction occurs in one region, its effects ripple across the globe. When economic crises strike one nation, others feel the impact. We can no longer pretend that our fortunes are separate from the fortunes of people on the other side of the planet. The pandemic that began in 2019 demonstrated this with devastating clarity. Nations that thought they could isolate themselves discovered the limits of such isolation. Viruses do not respect borders, neither do climate patterns, economic flows, or the cascading consequences of political instability. Mozi lived in a fragmented world of warring kingdoms, each pursuing its own interests, with little regard for the broader human community. In some ways, we have made progress since then. International institutions, however imperfect, attempt to coordinate responses to shared challenges. Human rights frameworks, whatever their limitations in practice, establish that certain protections apply to all people regardless of nationality. The idea that aggressive warfare is illegal, enshrined in modern international law, owes something to the Mohist tradition, even if that debt is rarely acknowledged. Yet in other ways, we have made distressingly little progress. Nations still prioritize their own interests over global welfare. Leaders still appeal to partiality, to the conviction that our people matter more than their people, to justify policies that harm outsiders. The logic of graded love that Mozi criticized continues to structure international relations, producing conflicts that kill thousands and displace millions. The effective altruism movement, which has gained significant attention in recent years, draws upon reasoning that Mozi would have recognized immediately. Effective altruists argue that we should try to do the most good we can with our resources, evaluating charitable interventions based on their actual consequences rather than their emotional appeal. This is pure consequentialism, pure Mohist methodology applied to contemporary philanthropy. Peter Singer, one of the movement's philosophical inspirations, makes arguments about our obligations to distant strangers that echo across 25 centuries from Mozi's debates with the Confucians. Environmental challenges add new dimensions to these ancient questions. Climate change affects everyone on the planet, but its impacts fall disproportionately on those least responsible for causing it. Responding effectively requires exactly the kind of impartial concern for all people's welfare that Mozi advocated. If we care only about our own nation's short-term interests, we will fail to address a problem that threatens everyone's long-term survival. Only something like universal love can motivate the cooperation necessary to face global challenges. The Mohist emphasis on moderation and rejection of wasteful luxury also speaks to contemporary concerns about consumption and sustainability. We live in societies that constantly encourage us to buy more, consume more, accumulate more. Mozi would ask, does this actually make people better off? Does endless consumption serve human welfare, or does it squander resources that could address genuine needs? These questions are not merely philosophical, but urgently practical as we confront the limits of our planet's capacity to support human activity. Even Mozi's rejection of fatalism finds contemporary application. We are often told that certain problems are too big to solve, that human nature makes conflict inevitable, that the suffering of distant others is simply beyond our power to address. This kind of fatalism excuses inaction and protects those who benefit from the status quo. Mozi's fierce insistence on human agency, his conviction that we can change our circumstances through effort and will, stands as a rebuke to such comfortable pessimism. Of course, Mozi's answers are not the only possible answers to these questions. The Confucian critique of universal love still has force. Many people genuinely believe that special obligations to family and nation are not merely natural, but morally appropriate, that the bonds of kinship and citizenship create duties that cannot be dissolved into universal impartiality. These debates continue, and it would be presumptuous to claim that Mozi settled them once and for all. What Mozi offers is not a final resolution but a challenging perspective, a voice from across the millennia asking whether we have really thought through the implications of our partial loves and selective concerns. When we care more about suffering nearby than suffering far away, when we value lives like our own more than lives different from our own, when we accept violence committed by our side while condemning identical violence committed by others, we might hear Mozi's gentle but insistent question, why? What justifies these distinctions? How would you feel if you were on the other side? The philosopher has done his work. The arguments have been made. The consequences of partiality and the benefits of universal love have been laid out as clearly as human language permits. What remains is for each of us, in our own circumstances, and according to our own judgment, to decide how to respond. As you rest tonight, perhaps some of these questions will drift through your mind, not as problems demanding immediate solution, but as invitations to reflection. We are all, whether we recognize it or not, constantly making choices about who deserves our concern and why. Mozi asks us to make those choices consciously, to think about what we are doing and whether it is truly justified. That question, ancient as it is, remains as fresh as tomorrow. The night has grown late now, and the time has come to let abstract philosophy settle into something gentler, something more suited to the quiet approach of sleep. We have travelled far tonight, through ancient battlefields and palace confrontations, through logical arguments and historical tragedies, through questions that touch the deepest foundations of how we should live. Mozi walked 300 miles to save strangers he had never met. That simple fact, stripped of all its philosophical significance, speaks to something essential about human possibility. We are capable of caring beyond our immediate circles. We can extend ourselves for people who will never know our names, never thank us, never return the favour. This capacity may be rare in its full expression, but it exists, and its existence suggests something hopeful about what human beings might become. Consider, as you settle deeper into rest, the web of connections that sustains your own life. The food you ate today passed through countless hands before reaching you. The shelter that protects you tonight was built by workers you never met. The knowledge you carry in your mind was accumulated by generations of thinkers across cultures and centuries. We are all, already, embedded in networks of care and contribution that extend far beyond our awareness. Mozi's vision of universal love is not, from this perspective, asking us to become something entirely different from what we already are. It is asking us to become conscious of what we already do unconsciously, to extend deliberately what we already extend accidentally, to recognize and embrace the interconnection that is already the fundamental fact of human existence. The stranger on the other side of the world, whom you will never meet, is connected to you through chains of cause and effect that no one fully understands. Your actions ripple outward in ways you cannot trace. Their actions ripple back toward you. We are all, in some sense, already caring for each other, already depending on each other, already part of a single human community that encompasses everyone. What Mozi offers is an invitation to see this truth more clearly and to act upon it more consciously, not to suppress the natural love we feel for those closest to us, but to extend something of that love outward, to feel something of that concern for those we will never know. The mother who loves her own children fiercely can also feel something of that love for all children everywhere. The citizen who cares about their own country's welfare can also care about the welfare of countries on the other side of the world. This extension of love is not a burden, but a liberation. The person whose concern is limited to a narrow circle lives in a cramped world, constantly worried about threats from outside, constantly measuring others as potential competitors or resources. The person whose concern expands outward lives in a larger world finds allies everywhere, discovers that most people want the same basic things and can work together to achieve them. Perhaps tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you can experiment with this expansion of concern. Think of someone you know well, someone you love naturally and easily. Feel the warmth of that connection. Now extend that same feeling, even slightly, towards someone more distant, someone you barely know, and then further toward people you have never met but know exist, people living their lives on the other side of your city, your country, your world. This is not a demand for heroic self-sacrifice. It is not asking you to walk 300 miles or sleep in the rain outside city walls. It is simply an invitation to notice how interconnected we already are, and to let that awareness colour how you think about the world and your place in it. The rain falls equally on all fields. The sun shines on everyone without discrimination. The air that fills your lungs tonight is the same air that circles the entire planet, exchanged constantly between all living beings. We are already sharing this world in ways more intimate than we usually recognize. The oxygen molecules entering your body right now have passed through countless other lungs before reaching you. Some of them may have been breathed by Mozi himself 25 centuries ago as he walked those 300 miles to prevent a war. The carbon atoms in your cells were once part of ancient forests, perhaps even of the wood Mozi shaped with his carpenter's hands. We are connected across time as well as space, bound to every human who ever lived, and every human who ever will live through the matter and energy we all share. This is not mysticism, but chemistry, physics, biology. The boundaries we draw between ourselves and others are conceptual conveniences, useful for certain purposes, but not ultimately real. The universe knows nothing of the distinction between self and other. It circulates matter and energy indifferently, weaving all beings together in a fabric of shared existence that no human ideology can separate. Mozi saw this truth more clearly than most, and he dedicated his life to helping others see it too. His methods were sometimes harsh, his arguments relentless, his standards uncompromising. But beneath all the philosophical apparatus was something simpler, a conviction that human beings matter, all of them, and that our failure to recognize this is the source of most of our suffering. That conviction does not require you to agree with every detail of Mohist philosophy. It does not require you to accept his metaphysics of heaven and spirits, or his specific policy recommendations, or his views about music and funerals. It requires only that you take seriously the question he posed. What would it mean to care for all people equally? And having taken that question seriously, to let it inform how you live your life. The hours have passed, and we arrive at the end of our journey through Mozi's remarkable life and thought. From his humble origins as a carpenter's son to his confrontation with kings, from his systematic philosophy of universal love to his tragic erasure from history, from his ancient wisdom to its contemporary relevance, we have traced the arc of a vision that was too revolutionary for its own time, and may still be too revolutionary for ours. Mozi asked us to imagine a world without the conflicts generated by partiality, a world where people cared for each other without discrimination, where wars would cease because no one would value their own nation's interests above humanity's common welfare. That vision may seem impossibly idealistic, but ideals are not meant to be achieved immediately. They are meant to guide our steps in better directions, to illuminate possibilities we might otherwise miss, to keep us striving towards something worthier than our present condition. If you found value in tonight's exploration, If Mozi's story spoke to something in you, I hope you will consider subscribing to join our quiet community of nighttime philosophers. By sharing this video and leaving a comment about where in the world you are listening from, you help these ancient conversations reach others who seek wisdom in the stillness of evening. There is one final image I want to leave you with as you drift towards sleep. Picture Mozi on that last night in song, after his 600-mile journey to prevent a war, after his triumphant confrontation with kings and engineers, making his way toward the city he had saved. The rain is falling. The guards at the gate do not recognize him. They see only a ragged stranger of no apparent importance. They turn him away, and Mozi, without complaint, finds a ditch outside the walls to sleep in. The city sleeps peacefully behind him, its inhabitants unaware of how close they came to destruction, unaware of who stands watch in the rain. This is what universal love looks like when it is truly lived. Not the love that seeks recognition or reward, not the love that expects gratitude or reciprocity, but the love that gives, simply because giving is what love does. The love that walks 300 miles to save strangers, and then accepts being treated like a stranger by those very strangers. We may never achieve such love ourselves. Most of us will live our entire lives without being tested in ways that reveal what we are truly capable of. But knowing that such love is possible, that at least one person lived it so completely, can shift something subtle in how we see the world. If Mozi could love like that, perhaps love of that kind is not impossible for human beings. Perhaps it is only very rare and very difficult, and waiting to be discovered in the most unexpected places. The rain continues to fall on that ancient night. The philosopher sleeps. The city he saved dreams of ordinary things, never knowing what passed so close by. And across 25 centuries his story reaches you, listener, wherever you are, whatever your circumstances, however far you may be from ancient China or questions of universal love. Something in you responded to this story, or you would not have listened so long. Something in you recognized the beauty of a man who walked 300 miles to prevent a war. That recognition is itself a form of love, a participation in the vision Mozi articulated so long ago. In feeling moved by his story, you join the community of those who have glimpsed, however briefly, what it might mean to care for everyone equally. Let that glimpse accompany you into sleep tonight. Let Mozi's rain-soaked figure stand watch in your dreams, a reminder of what is possible when love breaks free of its usual limits. Tomorrow you will wake to a world that still struggles with the problems Mozi diagnosed, a world of partiality and conflict and selective concern. But you will wake knowing that another way has been imagined, has been articulated, has even been lived by at least one remarkable human being. And perhaps, in some small way, that knowledge will shape the choices you make and the person you continue to become. Rest well, fellow travelers in the garden of ancient wisdom. The great conversation about how we should live continues, and your presence in it, however modest, adds something irreplaceable to the ongoing work of humanity seeking its better nature. In the rhythm of your breathing, in the gradual release of today's concerns, you participate in the fundamental trust that Mozi saw as the beginning of all genuine wisdom. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with something of that revolutionary love still warming your heart.